it's now time to introduce our next speaker, who is the Reverend Dr. Justin Tomkins. Justin's an Anglican priest, currently serving 7 village churches within the Chelmsford Diocese. He trained for ordination at Trinity College, Bristol, where he obtained an MPhil in theology, researching a theological engagement with human enhancement. His previous background is in chemistry, including a PhD from the University of Cambridge. Actually, Justin and I were PhD students in the department at the same time. So during his PhD, he explored the use of DNA as a molecular scaffold, and he followed that with a short postdoc at the Hebrew University in Jerusalem. And generally now he's engaging with the wider area of faith and technology, and he'll be speaking to us on the topic of living with hope in a world of AI. So I would like to hand over to Justin now.
Sarah, thanks ever so much. That's really kind. Good to be with you all. As Sarah said, I'm working as a parish priest, but I've had a chance to think about faith and technology over these past years, and that's what I draw upon now. And the plan for the next hour is that I'll tell some stories for 15, 20 minutes, and then I hope that if it can be arranged for us, that we split into bus groups for 3 or 4 minutes. We think about hopes and fears in relation to those things, and then we come back together, we focus on hope, living with hope in a world of AI, and then we go into a time of Q&A. But let's start with some stories. And I was fascinated by reading the way that Robert Epstein, a psychologist from America, reported his experience of falling in love with Ivana from Russia. An experience back in 2007, and they met through a dating site. He was attracted by the photo, and they engaged with one another through the computer over a number of months, and he described himself falling in love. It was only towards the end of 4 months that he discovered that she was actually a bit of software. And he said that had he not wanted that relationship to work, then he would have picked up some of the cues earlier on. But he did want the relationship to work, and it took 4 months before he discovered that he was communicating with this chatbot, bit of software designed to communicate with a human being. And we might all have our own feelings about would we have been taken in or not. But there are a number of people who have been exploring how can we get machines to hold conversations with human beings, the Turing test. And there's a Loebner Prize, which is one particular Turing test, which has been going on for a number of years now. And within that particular Turing test, you have a number of bits of software, a number of human participants, and then some human judges. And the human judges have 5 minutes to interact through the computer with something else. They don't know whether something else is another person or it's a bit of software. And the judges need to seek to distinguish between the bit of software and the human. And Brian Christian is a writer, journalist, who was one of the human participants back in 2009 when the prize was held in Brighton. And he's written about that experience, and he prepared to take part in that competition. He'd read about the way that these early bits of software had fallen down when it came to things like and are, and those non-words which are used in human conversation. So recognized that being identified as human wasn't all about sophistication and being articulate, that actually some of our flaws also identify us as being human. He also noted that one of the machines who was most successful at fooling the judges into thinking that it was actually a human being did so by being programmed to be moody, irritable, and obnoxious. And Brian Christian thought that that was both saddening, but also a kind of call to arms. And he was determined that in seeking to distinguish himself from these bits of software, he'd do that in a way which celebrated what it was to be human. And at the end of that competition, there was one of the bits of software which was given the prize for being the most human computer. And of the 4 human participants, Brian Christian won the prize for being the most human human. If you want to have a look at that later on, The Most Human Human is the book that he wrote about that experience afterwards. And he was the participant who judges found it easiest to distinguish from the machines. But actually all of the human participants in 2009 had kind of raised their game and were easier to distinguish from the machines than the year before. The year before, in 2008, humans had lost 5 votes against the machines as the judges were trying to distinguish who was who. In 2009, all of the humans were more distinguishable. And Brian, as he was reflecting on that after his experience in that competition, was saying that when machines get better at doing things which traditionally have only been done by humans, then we face a choice. We can either say, okay, the machines have got better and better at these areas, so as humans, we're going to disengage from these areas and we'll focus on other things that machines can't do. Or alternatively, we say, okay, machines are getting much better at mimicking human behavior. Let's raise our game too. Let's become more fully human, more fully alive. Let's see how we can develop our own strengths as human beings, even as machines are starting to mimic them. I'm going to hold up another book. This is by Garry Kasparov, who famously was beaten by the IBM machine Deep Blue back in 1997 when Kasparov was the chess grandmaster at that time. And as Kasparov reflected back on that experience 20 years later, when he was writing in 2017, he talked about collaboration between humans and machines. And he talked about the way that after chess software programs were able to beat the best human players, humans didn't retreat from that field, but actually a new collaborative field emerged, the field of centaur chess, where humans will play against one another, but using computer software to aid them as they do that. So on each side of the chessboard is a human, but not a human alone, a human collaborating with a machine. Some of you may have been at a conference 2.5 years ago now. It's put on by Christians in Science. And the speaker at the end of that day on robotics and artificial intelligence was Bishop Stephen Croft, who's still the bishop in Oxford. And at the end of the day, Bishop Stephen Croft said that he'd come to think through the work that he was doing in the House of Lords, representing the church in the House of Lords discussions on artificial intelligence, that artificial intelligence was a spectrum. And at one end of this spectrum was the Terminator robot. And at the other end of the spectrum was the Tesco Club card or other supermarket loyalty cards. And Bishop Stephen Croft said on that occasion, we tend to spend more time worrying about the Terminator robot, whereas actually it's something like the supermarket loyalty card, which will have more of an impact upon our lives going forward. And there's a scenario which is often spoken about, written about in relation to AI, of a paperclip apocalypse that you may have heard. The idea is that a powerful AI software is put in charge of building a factory to produce paperclips. But if the instructions to that AI are not clear, then the AI will go ahead and will be very, very successful at producing paperclips and could eventually turn all of the resources within the universe into either paperclips or factories to make paperclips. And Tom Chivers is somebody who mentions that idea, and the title of his book, The AI Does Not Hate You, refers to that scenario. It's a quote from a philosopher called Eliezer Yudkowsky, which says, "The AI does not hate you, nor does it love you, but you're made of atoms which it can use for something else." Now, I think Bishop Stephen Croft would say, okay, we don't need to worry too much about the whole universe being turned into paperclips, but there are things that we need to engage with when we think about living in a world of AI. And picking up on Bishop Stephen Croft's comment about the supermarket loyalty card, you may have read a number of years ago that Target, a supermarket in America, started to spot the correlation between pregnant women and unscented body lotion and vitamins and cotton wool. So very straightforward grocery product of the unscented lotion and the vitamins and the cotton wool. And they picked up that pregnant women were starting to buy the unscented lotion halfway through pregnancy, and then they'd start to buy vitamin tablets. And when they started to buy cotton wool, that was a sign that the baby had either arrived or was nearby. And so they would send out related marketing for baby food and those sorts of products soon after. And one father received this advertising in the post addressed to his teenage daughter, and he was outraged by this. He thought it was scandalous that the supermarket were targeting these ads to her. He didn't know that his teenage daughter was pregnant, but the supermarket AI had worked that out before he had. And thinking about the American election back in 2016, with Facebook and Cambridge Analytica, we know that there's all sorts of work which has gone on to work with data to understand the way that data can be used to influence us to buy products or to behave in a particular way. And that develops very, very quickly. It's a different field, but another story that I just want to throw into the mix at this stage in this session is that of IBM's Watson. So after Deep Blue had beaten Gary Kasparov back in 1997, IBM gathered together about 7 years later, 2004, and they wanted another grand challenge that they could use to gain publicity for their products. And in that discussion and exploration of what was their next grand challenge to be, they focused on the American quiz show Jeopardy. And they recognized that they have a lot to do to build a computer program that could beat the best humans at this quiz show of Jeopardy. They'd need to work with human language, with humor, with sorting through massive amounts of data, with analyzing what was the likelihood of different answers being more likely or less likely. And they, as we know, they worked at that challenge. And by 2011, there was a televised show where IBM's Watson, the kind of grandson of Deep Blue, as it were, competed against two human Jeopardy champions. And where each answer is a question. One of the answers that IBM's Watson gave in response to the question, iron fitting on the hoof of a horse or card dealing box within a casino, where the answer needed to be a question, Watson was able to respond, what is a shoe? And responded to so many other questions correctly that he got more than twice the number of dollars representing points than the other candidates, more points than the two of them combined. And one of those human champions said at the end of the show, "I, for one, welcome our new computer overlord," recognizing that a computer had done something that 7 years before felt like a real challenge for those who were developing that bit of software. And IBM didn't stop at that point in 2011. They went on and they worked out how could they use these transferable skills that they'd been able to put within this computer that won the quiz show. And they recognized that there was real potential for deploying the software within the world of medicine. And they have used IBM's Watson over the last years to augment the ability of medical professionals to diagnose illness and to recommend treatments. And it's not been a straightforward path. It hasn't all been plain sailing, but IBM's Watson has been recognized, credited with diagnosing a form of leukemia that doctors hadn't been able to recognize before, finding 5 genes linked to motor neurone disease. Okay, so a few minutes before we come together and buzz, and I hesitate to, let me show you, there's Jeopardy. If you want to read more about the journey of developing IBM's Watson, Final Jeopardy by Stephen Baker is a book that you might be interested in. I hesitate to mention a Dan Brown book, Origin, but the reason that I mention Dan Brown's Origin is just that sometimes through novels and through films, we can get a sense of how is wider society engaging with some of these areas. And the core focus of Dan Brown's Origin is an artificial intelligence who is involved throughout the book. And the other thread of the book that I think that is interesting in this context is that there's an exploration within the book about, does the developments in technology mean that religion is finished? And there's a fictional atheist within the book who declares that the age of religion is drawing to a close and the age of science is dawning. And so often I think we find that when some of these issues of AI and robotics are explored within society, some of the questions that we've been thinking about earlier on today about science and faith are questions which will arise. Okay, 2 more very short stories before we gather into buzz groups. One on self-driving cars. And I noted last year that there was a report that there was a plan to race self-driving cars around Indianapolis this year. I don't know whether COVID will put a stop to that or not, but the hope was that self-driving cars would be in a position to race around Indianapolis this year. There was an interesting bit of reporting back in 2016 around self-driving cars, when a representative of Mercedes at a car show was being asked about what one of these self-driving vehicles would do in the event of a collision, and what about human life outside the car, inside the car? What about dealing with some of the ethical issues involved? How do you program a car to cope with the ethical issues which might be involved? And this Mercedes representative went on to say, well, if we can save a life, we will do, and was focusing on the life inside the car and saying, we don't know what we control outside the car, but we can work to save the life inside the car, and we do that. That provoked a bit of uproar on social media afterwards, and 76% of people who were surveyed afterwards said that they disagreed. They wanted to prioritize all life. It didn't matter whether it was the driver or the passengers inside the car or those outside on a pavement or in another vehicle. We needed to prioritize all life. We couldn't just focus on those inside the self-driving car. And so it seemed like Mercedes, that spokesman, had not been in touch with what was going on within the thought within society. But then those same people were surveyed and said, which car would you buy? Would you buy the car that prioritised the life of those inside the car, or priorities all human life equally? And that 76% of people dropped dramatically. And the majority of people then said, if they had to choose what car they would buy one which would prioritise life inside. Last story, it's a connected two stories, and it's from this book, Hello World, by Hannah Fry, who also talks about self-driving cars. And Hannah helps us think through, when is it right for a human to intervene? If a machine, AI, robot has been given influence in a particular situation, do we want a human to intervene or not? And she tells a joke, supposedly from airline pilots, about the best system for flying a plane. And apparently the best system for flying a plane is a pilot and a dog and a computer. And the computer is there to fly the plane. The pilot is there to feed and to care for the dog. And the dog is there to bite the human pilot if they try and interfere with the computer. And we might think, okay, well, sometimes it's good for a human to override a machine, and sometimes it's not. One example that many of us will have heard of, Stanislav Petrov, a Russian military officer in 1983, is reported to have been part of the nuclear missile detection system in Russia. And missiles showed up on his screen. His role was then to report that, but if he reported that, there was a chance that a retaliatory strike would be launched. He thought that this strike didn't look right. It was only 5 missiles, and so he waited on the hunch that this wasn't a real strike. Sure enough, there was a problem within the software of that system, and it was wonderful that he intervened and that he didn't pass on that alarm immediately. Many would say that he saved lives through doing that. There's another situation though, Alton Towers, back in 2015, there was a problem on a roller coaster, and the engineers found the fault and they sent an empty carriage back around the roller coaster. What they didn't notice was that there was an additional fault, and so that carriage remained out on the ride. Sure enough, the machine told them that there was a problem. Another light flashed, but the engineers knew that they just solved one problem. They didn't know that there was another, so they overrode the alarm system. They sent a new carriage back around the ride with people in this time, and those passengers collided with the carriage, which had remained at the bottom of the ride, and people were injured. So some situations where it's been helpful for a human being to intervene, another where it hasn't. We'll explore a little bit more about how we live with hope in that context in a moment. But first of all, I wonder, Keith, whether you and others at Faraday could send us into groups for maybe 3 minutes now, just to discuss with one another, maybe in 4s. Thank you, Sarah. What hope and fear in relation to AI are provoked by these stories and other things we've been aware of? What hopes and fears are provoked in us, these stories and others that we might be aware of? Thank you. Because I hope that you've had a chance to just reflect a little bit over the last couple of moments on hopes and fears, maybe hopes and fears that were triggered by some of what I said earlier, maybe hopes and fears that you've carried with you for some time. But I want to offer 4 ideas about living with hope. One is about becoming more human rather than less human ourselves in the context in which machines are mimicking human behavior. Something about the practical engagement with others that has a bit of overlap with thinking about creation, care and climate change before. Thinking about ultimate hope and then about Christians who are working professionally in these fields. So I won't say very much more now about the first of those. I've mentioned that already in relation to Brian Christian and Gary Kasparov. But it feels to me that if we're to live with hope in this context, then we will be seeking to be more human ourselves and not less. And that this whole area of artificial intelligence raises questions about what does it mean for us to be human, and what does distinguish us from machines, and how can we accentuate those qualities that we most admire in one another. And Brian Christian may have been given that prize for being the most human, but we might want to look to Jesus and say that actually in Jesus we see what it is to be fully human and fully alive, and he calls us to live in that sort of a way ourselves. And then something about practically supporting one another, engaging with one another, caring for society, and the issues of jobs and unemployment is something that was named within the buzz group that I was part of a moment ago. And it does seem that as if there are real issues to be addressed about how do we care for one another in the context where there may be increasing unemployment due to technology, AI, robotics. I don't know if you saw, but back in 2017, there was a robot priest deployed in Martin Luther's hometown of Wittenberg in Germany to mark 500 years since the Reformation. And this robot priest, bless you too, could give blessings in 5 different languages. And people would come in, they would select their language, and then they'd be giving a blessing by this robot priest. Now, I can't do that. So I don't know how long I'll continue to be deployed in the parish here, but we do know that jobs are something that are affected by automation. And 2 ways that I want to name in relation to that. One is the number of people to carry out a particular task. Kodak, past leader of photography, once employed 145,000 people working for Kodak in its heyday. Instagram, we might say, has taken on the mantle of dealing with photos. When it was bought by Facebook for $1 billion in 2012, it had just 13 people working for it. So organizations don't necessarily need the same number of people that they had in the past. WhatsApp was recently valued at $19 billion. At that time, it had just 55 employees. Just one other aspect of jobs that might make us think about employment and how we care for one another. Increasingly, we're turning, and I think COVID has just sped up this process. We might turn to a bit of software to get some health advice. eBay and others are using bits of software to arbitrate, to resolve conflict between buyers and sellers rather than using a human judge. Students are being able to engage with lectures through universities at a distance because of online learning. And again, COVID is changing that now. So as we think about the command to love our neighbour as ourselves, how is that going to need to be applied in a world of AI and in robotics? And there are many people who are predicting that our financial systems will need to change as a consequence. Many people saying that we might see some universal basic income in the future. How will we engage with some of those things? Thirdly, how do we put our hope in the right place? And we know that the Bible promises the hope of new heaven and a new earth. And I guess that the whole question of living with hope in a world of AI raises the question of how much Are we using AI and other forms of technology to be more fully human, to be more fully alive at this point as we look ahead to new heaven and new earth? And where are we seeing the ultimate hope is being placed in AI or technology? And where might we distinguish between those two? How do we identify? Are we placing appropriate hope in technology, or are we placing ultimate hope in technology, where actually our ultimate hope can only be sustained elsewhere? The last thing that I want to name before we move into a time of Q&A is a bit of research that I did between the end of 2019 and the beginning of 2020. It ended just about the time that that COVID was beginning, so it wasn't really affected by COVID. But I emailed many different clergy within the Church of England, and I said to them, would you please pass on this invite to complete a survey to any scientists or medics or technologists within your congregation? And out of those emails that I sent out, over 300 scientists, medics, technologists within the Church of England completed that survey. And they were answering questions to do with what encourages you about your work, what ethical issues are raised by your work, what glimpses of the future do you get through your work, how do you want us to be praying for you? And of those 300 Christians who responded, working professionally in those fields, 20 said that they were working within the field of artificial intelligence. And I want to read some of their answers for you. So in relation to that question, please name a significant ethical question raised by your area of work which society needs to consider. Some of the responses that I had were, how much data should be collected about our children's activities at school? Automation will result in reduction of job numbers and displacement of a significant percentage of the workforce. And then the question, can AI systems be moral and fair in how they support decisions that impact human beings in relation to HR recruitment, for example? And then in relation to this second question, how would you like the church to be praying for your area of work now and in the future? Some of those Christians working in the field of AI gave these responses. One said, for more scientists and technologists to take seriously the impact that AI is having on society. Another asked prayer for wisdom in my research. Somebody else said, for Christian relationships and continued involvement in the world of technical work. Somebody else said that we understand new impacts of old technologies and do not focus all of our attention on the novel or fantastical. And somebody else said, for technology to empower rather than eclipse our humanity, and for AI to complement human intelligence. 3 more questions that I'll give you brief responses to. One was, how do you see your area of work developing in the next decade? Somebody very simply said rapidly. Another said more automation and robotics. Somebody said more focus on driverless cars, electric cars. Then, how do you see your area of work changing society in the next decade? Somebody said, as we create smarter systems, we will hopefully use less waste and power. Somebody else, I hope that it will enable society to become more aware of the risks and understand the limitations of technology, appreciate when they should and when they should not trust these systems. Somebody saying, healthcare will utilize technology to improve efficiency. Somebody said data about social processes will change the autonomy of different professions, like the way that university students and healthcare and judges are all affected. And final question, are there any other comments relating to your area of work that you think it would be helpful for the church and society to consider as we look towards the future? And these experts in AI worshipping in local churches, one of them said AI and robot technology raise important questions about what it means to be human, which we need to address. Somebody else said advancing brain understanding in AI will increasingly inform science perspectives on religious belief and the essence of human thought, and then in brackets, and the soul, question mark. Somebody else warned, don't fall prey to the temptation to broadly criticize tech and innovation, but advocate for its specific wise application to the challenges we face. Then Christians need to play an active role in whatever sphere of employment they're in. And then finally, technology is here to stay, for better or worse. Perhaps help people to understand that it's neither good nor bad in itself, rather it's the uses to which it's put that will impact people's lives. So I'm glad that we ended with the voice of some of those Christians working in the area. Maybe you'll join me now at a time of Q&A and we can reflect together for a little bit.